It's an absolutely essential topic for any type of risk management portfolio or corporate planning. And what we're looking to do is see how we coalesce all of the many issues that are happening around the world, the flashpoints that really have the potential to disrupt and upset the international order as we know it. So whether we're talking about critical political decisions being made in Beijing about the South China Sea, that affects trade routes, that affects energy supplies, and that affects potentially military stability with Japan and South Korea and India. When we talk about what's happening between Russia and Europe, in the Ukraine and the Baltics, now Russia projecting power in Syria and really filling a vacuum from an outside power perspective. And then, of course, the Middle East, where developments are never just internal to the Middle East, but spill over, unfortunately, into Europe and into the streets of the United States. These are necessary issues for executives, for risk officers, for boards of directors to consider when they're planning, corporate-wise, investment-wise, for 6 months out, 12 months out, 5 or 10 years out. And without understanding how and why political decisions are made, you don't really have the most effective risk management portfolio in place.
Right. So if you were thinking going forward a year or so, are there other areas that you haven't mentioned, like you mentioned China, Russia, Middle East, that's a pretty broad group. Are there areas that you think that are emerging but not yet on your, say, top 3 list?
Well, history shows that we're always confronted with the so-called black swan events. They're black swan events precisely because they're rather unpredictable. But if we look at some of the flashpoint areas where we know there's going to be trouble, there are some areas that I would say are off the radar that we may wind up having to pay attention to in a year or two. So for instance, Russia, they've firmly implanted themselves in Crimea and in Ukraine. But there are several other areas in Europe that could become potential flashpoints. One is a very small strip of land between Moldova, which is sandwiched between Romania and Ukraine, called Transdniester. But it's filled with ethnic Russians and Russian-speaking citizens. And the Russians have made very clear they will protect the rights of ethnic Russians outside their borders. Wow. That may be an area where they're testing NATO's ability to push back against Russia. And again, do it very incrementally. I have no reason to believe that Russia is interested in any type of a war with NATO or with the United States. What they are interested in doing is in undermining NATO and European cohesion. So if they can do it there, they can do it possibly in the Baltics, either in countries that are in the European Union or in sovereign territory called Kaliningrad. So that may become a black swan area for us in the near future as well. And if North Korea, for instance, is able to put a nuclear bomb on a missile, not only can they potentially threaten the United States because they'll be able to reach the continental US with those missiles, but we may see countries like Japan and South Korea seek out a nuclear arsenal of their own, and that'll trigger a response from China. So you have a cascading effect of nuclear proliferation in an area of the world where 1/3 of all global commerce takes place. So the potential is there for very, very disruptive events in areas that are known to be very difficult, very challenging, but you may have new flashpoints emerging out of existing flashpoints.
Right. And clearly you can see a risk manager would be so concerned and want to study these types of points, certainly from a perspective of where investments are made, but also where one opens and offers services and businesses.
Absolutely. First of all, we have to keep in mind that 90% of all global commerce takes place on shipping containers. So we have an absolute obligation to work with our allies and to deter foes who might look to block those shipping lanes and disrupt global commerce and supply chains. So we have a very vested interest there in working with our allies, trying to steer our foes away from those kinds of scenarios that can cause, well, not just tensions, but those can escalate into conflicts. Those are completely unpredictable, both in terms of how they start and in terms of how they end.
Right.
And so that becomes very, very disruptive, not only to the established shipping lanes and supply chains that we talk about, but think about what it does to currency exchanges, to financial markets. And thinking back to what happened in 07, 08, 09, I don't think anyone in the West or anywhere in the world really wants to see that kind of a return to crisis anytime soon.
Right. Well, I guess it would be hard not to talk about geopolitical risk and not talk about the U.S. election coming up in less than 50 days. Maybe you could give your perspective on that?
Well, knowing that this video may be watched, this interview, by people after the election, it's always very, very cautionary making any clear predictions. What we do know is that as of today, September 20th, the day of the conference, that we're in a very tight race. And we see that Hillary Clinton is still in the lead. And she's had the lead essentially since we began polling on the 2016 presidential election. But Donald Trump seems to have rebounded considerably since mid-August, and Hillary Clinton has been having a number of challenges. Again, going forward, we have no idea whether those challenges will have continued or whether she'll have overcome them and Trump begins to move back. But what I think happens no matter what the outcome of the election is we've seen the United States demographic in a very different light with this election. Both the Democratic and the Republican parties are continuously being pulled more to the extreme. And we see also what I would call not the rise, but maybe the return of the white working class male voter, which made himself felt very much with the rise of the Donald Trump candidacy. And I think it was a recent poll that showed that 85% of white working class men believe that the government has utterly abandoned them and failed them. And they're making that felt. But then we have that balanced out by which way college women go, whether they will continue to come out, say, for a Republican candidate, as they have in the past, or are they so repelled by many of Donald Trump's statements and positions that they'll either sit out the election or wind up voting for Hillary Clinton. So you have a number of states that are traditionally in play, and then you have another 8 or 10 states that tend to be solidly Democratic or even solidly Republican, that are now being pursued by the other candidate. Either way, this is going to be an absolutely historic election, and it begins in a few days with the first debate that many believe will have more viewers than recent Super Bowls.
Right.
Just think about that.
It is amazing. I have to say, the one thing I can say about this election, it's certainly been entertaining.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for your comments today.
Pleasure to be with you.
Thanks.